Hi, hello again. And part two to my son and his summons for non-traffic case, right? On the south side for the incident that happened on the south side. All right, we lived in Chartier City for a long time. For at least for about 7-8 years. We lived in Chartier City. And I had neighbors. I had some neighbors to the left of me who we became great with. We went to their family functions. We talked outside. Their son came over my house and so forth. And my son hung out with their son a lot, right? He went to their son's football games. He hung out with them a lot. My son, they lived with me for several years. They asked, my son came to me and said, "Mom, can I go to South Carolina?" He said, "Could you go to South Carolina with them?" I said, "Yes, that's fine." My son went to South Carolina with the family. He came back. He said he had a great time. He had fun. You know, he enjoyed his time. And I'm going to tell you, we lived next door to these people for years. And we went to the community functions, community events. We went to every event. We went to school functions. All the kids literally went to the same school. A majority of the kids went to the same school, but you knew who the neighborhood in Chartier City was like a close-knit neighborhood. You knew who everybody was, right? You knew who everybody was. And especially if you went to the events, the neighborhood events and the children events and so forth, you knew who everyone was. My son, when I brought him home from Heritage Valley, when he had the drunk incident, he spazzed out, he spilled out. He got on the floor, and I was just holding him as he was sitting on the floor. I told him to lay down on the floor because the floor is a little colder, and I told him to lay down on the floor, and I was just holding him while he was laying down on the floor. Heritage Valley released him because he didn't want to stay. And he was in the car with me. He was still drunk. They said his alcohol level was really high, and he was still drunk. And I was talking to him, and he said, I remember my mom telling me, "Oh, Sean told me these stories about him being molested and so forth." And this is just how I talk. And I'm very outspoken. And I said, so my son says, "Mom, you don't know what happened to me." And then I said, "What happened?" And he's like, "Mom, I was molested." And I said, "Who was you molested by?" He said, "Some guy named Frank." And I said, "Where's Frank from?" He said, "In Chartier City." And I said, "Sean, we lived in Chartier City for several years." I said, "How old is Frank?" He said, "He's a boy." And I said, "A boy?" I said, "But we lived in Chartier City for several years." And I said, "So how was it some guy named Frank?" I said, "We were at baseball practice." I said, "Who is it, Sean?" And he said, "Mom, I don't really want to speak of my life situations because of the speaker that is playing above our head." And he was telling me, he said, I don't want to speak the truth of anything because of the sound speaker, the AI clout that's playing over our head. He said, "Mom, the machine, I can't really talk about nothing." That's what he said. He couldn't really talk about nothing. Because I said, "Who's Frank?" I said, "We lived in Chartier." The thing is, the situation is, we went to baseball. We was at baseball majority of the time. Baseball practice was a lot every single day. I was in majority of the days, right? And we were at baseball practice a lot. We got home probably around latest, probably 6, 7 o'clock. We would cook food and we would go to bed. Or sometimes he would hang out with his friend and go to his football practice. But we weren't at home a lot, and we went to school functions, school events, and I was very active in school functions and school events. And he went to the daycare. You know what I mean? Sean was barely outside to be outside. He was always active in sports and different activities. But he mentioned a guy named Frank. I worked with a guy named Frank at PA Health and Wellness. I was his trainer. And I'm sorry to release this information like this, but sometimes life takes different turn of events where situations have to be spoken about. And I trained Frank. But before I became a trainer, the other trainer said that they had concerns about who was being hired on. They said, who is interviewing some of these people? Because some of these people aren't equipped in the training room. And Frank came on. Frank had a hard time, but they interviewed Frank. And I I let Frank go back onto the floor and do his job. But Frank did have a hard time. And he didn't know some of the answers. He was having a hard time. Frank was having a hard time struggling with the answers and struggling with the classroom. But I helped him. I had to do one-on-one with Frank. Like, I would have to go up to his desk and guide him through. But I tried to find a different technique so that Frank could understand. But Frank went out onto the floor, but Frank wound up getting fired. I don't know why Frank got fired. I don't know how Frank lost his job. I don't know, but Frank struggled about getting the answers, like, you know what I mean? And I helped Frank one-on-one and tried to help him figure out the answers. That's the only Frank. And then there's another Frank that we weren't really near, but my grandma was acquainted with their family in Sheridan. That's another Frank I knew of. But other than that, there was 2 Franks and they were adults. So I was just trying to figure out what really happened. But then he said, Mom, I'm not going to be able to tell you the truth because of the speaker that's playing in the air. The noise that's playing. He said, Mom, I'm not going to be able to tell you the truth. He said, I don't want to tell you the truth because of the noise that's playing.